Hey, Steve, how's it going?
It's going really good, and it's going even better because we have a fantastic guest on the line with us. He is a Canadian broadcasting legend. I hope he's not embarrassed if I call him that, but he's worked everywhere, AWA, WWF, and morning radio, and everywhere in between. So I'd like to welcome Joe Aiello to the show. Joe, good evening.
Good evening. And no, I'm not embarrassed. I just think legend usually means old, right? Isn't that what it means?
Well, it does if you watch Legends House on WWE Network, but
Yeah.
we
I
used
haven't
it.
I haven't caught it yet. Those legends are a little older than this so-called one you have as a guest tonight. I appreciate you guys having me on.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And I think I'll actually defer to my co-host, Rowan, because he's the one who booked our interview tonight. So I want to let him ask the first question. Rowan, go ahead.
Well, thanks very much. So, Joe, when it comes to Legends House, it is quite the novelty. You're not missing a whole lot, so you don't really need to go out of your way to to go and see that. First of all, again, I don't want to say anything about your age, but aside from WWF in the early '90s, you were the voice of pro wrestling in Manitoba and in Western Canada. So I'm kind of starstruck to have you on the show here. I really appreciate it. So, my first question is, first of all, you being a Winnipeg product like myself, did you grow up in Winnipeg?
Yeah, I was born and raised here in Winnipeg, and it's funny because all I ever wanted to do as a kid was either get into wrestling or at least radio. And the funny thing is, you can probably hear this accent. A lot of people think I'm from like New York or something because of my Italian heritage, but I
Oh,
grew up
yeah.
in Winnipeg here, and the funny thing is, yeah, I've never lost that accent. And yeah, born and raised, worked my entire life here with a couple of stints on the road, wrestling wise, and yeah, wise I'm still doing it today. But I've always had kind of a passion, and always thought it was a fun hobby doing wrestling. And I had a couple of lucky breaks along the way, right? So I got started here in Winnipeg doing it, and had a chance to work with Ed Whalen near the end of his career doing some stuff for a company called the CNWA that ran out of Calgary, and that show was running nationally on TSN, so I got some exposure there. And then just doing some independent work here through Tony Condello with different factions. The AWA did a few shows with him here, and when I first started with him, he had just ended his relationship with sort of the UWF, and one of the first gigs I did with them was actually an NWA show with all the big names back in the day. Ric Flair, Lex Luger, Sting, Larry Zbyszko was there at the time, and a lot of good talent.
That's great. Now, when did you first meet Tony Condello? And for those that don't know, Tony is another sort of he's probably considered one of the biggest promoters in Canada. He's definitely considered a legend in Winnipeg and Manitoba. So, what was your first interaction with Tony, and what did he think of you when he first met you?
Well, Tony, of course, is another Italian Winnipegger, and has promoted wrestling for years and was a wrestler. A lot of enhancement work he did with the AWA, but was actually a big star locally on the independent scene when he ran his own promotion. But I actually met Tony at a social function and walked right up to him and said, "Hey, I'm a big fan of pro wrestling, and I sort of know the score, and I wouldn't mind getting involved as an announcer." And he kind of looked at me and was a little bewildered because he's all of about 5'5", and I'm 6'2", which would be considered tall for an Italian at my age. So I think he was more amazed at my height than anything else, and just maybe my cockiness at the time. And I was lucky enough that he brought me down to the studio one day, and I worked with a guy named Manny Bazunas, who was a local radio legend here at the time too. And Manny was so kind enough to let me in and do even like a mailbag segment, and he was just a big star, and I looked up to him anyway, and he was so kind in helping me out. And by that point, timing was everything. Manny was actually going to be moving to the West Coast, and that was about a year later, so I had a bigger role after that. But man, for the first year, it was like I had a mic stand stuck up my butt. I was so nervous and stiff. But self-taught television before HD.
So after you started working for Tony, was this before I guess he had been doing the Northern Death tours for quite a number of years prior to you joining him. Now, did you
I got
physically
lucky.
go on any? Did you? I was just going to ask. Did you physically go on any of these death tours, or was all the local TV done post production?
No, actually, it was funny because one of the first tours I did was not a death tour. It was a summer tour. I got smart. I went on the summer one, never the winter one. And it was funny because I actually booked my radio holidays. I was working. I just started in the radio business, and I was just working Tony's local show as a side gig, and I went up north and did TV because a lot of these Aboriginal reserves or just towns had like a local access television. So we'd go into the town, put on the suit jacket, and just do interviews with some of the talent that was booked on the shows, and it would just hype up the show. So it was a good experience for me anyway. I was pretty young at the time. So, but no, never did the winter tour. But if I could, I'll plug a documentary that if anybody wants to see what Tony Condello was all about, I think some of it is available on YouTube. And it's called The Promoter, the Tony Condello story. And it's a pretty neat story because Lance Storm has talked about him, Chris Jericho, a bunch of big-name Canadian entertainers have talked about not only maybe being on the tour, but meeting Tony. And it's pretty legendary stuff, actually.
Yeah, I've been trying, unfortunately, in vain now all week to get a copy of that. The only clip I saw was, I believe, like the 1-minute trailer, and they're showing them interviewing Edge with his really short hair.
I'll email you a contact. I can give it to you by tomorrow.
Awesome.
So maybe in the next couple of weeks, you guys can even have Tony on or something.
That'd be great.
If we could do that, that'd be sweet.
I'll work on that for you guys.
So at this point, you've been working with Tony now for a little while. As far as the production value goes, sorry?
So I was just going to say, at that point, yeah, Tony was doing a lot of the local TV shows here with some independent film crews. It wasn't through a specific television station crew like a lot of guys would have done in the past. These guys were all independent crews, and at that time, Don Callis was coming up the ranks, and he was doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes TV work too. And then I started doing some TV with me, but then even Bob Brown would actually have done some stuff for Tony and was actually sitting at the desk with me a little bit too, right? But it was really a big start for Don and I at the same time, just getting together and becoming good friends over doing TV. But Don really did a lot of the creative stuff later on with that WFWA and IWA programming.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to get to Don in just a little bit here. As far as the production values go during those WFW tours, or I guess the taping, how did it work as far as television goes? Like, did they tape like a certain number of episodes and then try to shop the tape around to different local stations, or did they have an agreement?
No. Yeah, they would have had agreements at that time. Tony's organization, depending on what name it was under, he would have had about 95% of Manitoba covered with CKY TV, which is a CTV affiliate here. And then he had part of Northern Ontario. He had actually Northern British Columbia, and he had television in Saskatchewan at the time too. And those were locked-in stations. Like every week, they were getting a pre-recorded show, a 1-hour show for 52 weeks.
Okay. This was, of course, before the internet, when we knew about spoilers and whatnot.
Yeah, but that was a big deal as far as Canada at the time, because Stampede was running for part of my time doing Tony's show, and then later they weren't. And there was a group in Calgary that ran the CNWA, and some of the talent was being shared. But and BC had a local access show going on at that time. But guys wanted to work to get themselves on tapes, so they could shop the tapes around to get work in Mexico, Japan, or even bigger companies like the WWF at the time. So it was a big deal for these guys to get on tape. So Winnipeg was a pretty good stepping stone for a lot of these guys, because a few other guys had traveled through here, right? So
yeah, I was going to ask,
go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to ask what the talent pool was like back then.
Well, there was different eras, I'd call it, with Tony, because there was sometimes it was nothing more than just a bunch of local stars, and you'd bring in a few guys from, let's say, Calgary to work. that had experience through the Heart Camp or something else, or even a few independent guys like Lenny St. Clair would come in through places like BC. We had Diamond Timothy Flowers, some real good independent guys come in on different levels. And then there was an era where it was bringing in some stars from the former AWA, like Jumpin' Jimmy Brunzell, Sheik Adnan El Casey, Chris Markoff, Scott Norris, Kenny Patera. A lot of these guys later on in their careers made a few stops here. Rick the Model Martel kept coming here on a regular basis. And then there was even days when the Baron von Raschke had made some appearances here too. So it was that run. And then like most independents would do now, you probably bring in a couple of, maybe bigger stars to tour. There was also an era when young guys like Lance Storm and Chris Jericho wanted to get themselves on tape. At this time, they had, I think, had just finished up with like Smoky Mountain Wrestling that Jim Cornette had, so they were doing some Canadian dates here for us. Gene Kaniski, the legend, was still around then too, and I actually got to do TV with Nick Bockwinkel, and he was the catalyst on the WWF stint for me.
Okay, yeah, I was actually just going to lead into that, but as far as Tony's booking philosophy goes, how in the loop were you when it came to the booking? Because like, for example, Jerry Lawler has said on numerous occasions that he doesn't like to know what's going to happen in the story. He likes to be surprised.
Right.
Did Tony let you know like how the matches were going to progress, and I guess depending on the TV situation, were you guys able to build like long-term storylines?
That was pretty tough. Don was probably more the player when it came to trying to stretch out storylines, because he had his vision when he did, had feuds with people like with Martel. Tony was more get the show together, more about the timing of the show, producing a lot of different matches, and then working like a storyline or at least inserts. And it was tough because when you're doing independent TV, to keep the cost down, you bring these guys in, and God knows you'd shoot about 35 matches and try and milk it as many weeks as you can, right, just to keep costs down. So I would say Tony's forte wasn't booking long-term storylines. That would have been Don as the natural, doing most of that work. And Tony would basically concentrate more on booking the dates, getting the shows out, and booking some of his TV talent around that. Me, on the other hand, didn't really need to know, because, it was whatever they wanted to do. I would just sort of be smartened up as far as I wanted to know a little bit what was progressing, or what angle they wanted me to take in calling a match, or where they wanted me to take it by the end of the program, especially if it was somebody like a Don and Martel angle. So, yeah.
Okay.
If that answers that question.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I was actually just going to ask if you had any other sort of production responsibilities besides behind the mic,
No.
but you kind of already did. So
sometimes we would record live at the venue, but a lot of times it would be in post-production, because it was just a cheaper way to do it. So by the time I got into the studio, like if they were taping on the road somewhere, I'd get in the studio, the show would be pretty much mapped out as far as how long the matches were. I'd call those, and then in post-production they'd put a 60-minute show together, right?
Okay, great. Stevie, what do you have? Do you have anything?
Oh, yeah, I've got a few questions. First of all, I want to thank Joe for mentioning that he kind of had that New York style and sound to his accent, because when my co-host sent me a clip of you calling a Lance Storm match, I had the exact same thought. I was like, wow, this guy really sounds New York for a guy from Winnipeg. So I picked up on that right away. And I know you do a lot of charitable work as an Italian living in Winnipeg. I know you do the Sons of Italy stuff. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, and get you a chance to plug your charitable work as well.
Oh, no problem. That actually, the Sons of Italy group was actually kind enough to back me on a couple of projects and give me an award for community awareness. But meanwhile, these guys are a big machine. They raise about $100,000 a year doing events. For me, it's smaller stuff. Like, I like to get out there. I've got a bunch of palliative care and cancer care kind of things I like to do. And a lot of it's tied in through radio and just outside events. But you know what? I've just been lucky. This is my hometown, and I'm just trying to make it a better place to live. I've had chances to move, and I never did. And I'm just happy to be here and happy that I get a voice to actually help some different causes, really. So just an easygoing guy that was to get to do what I wanted to do in life. So, and I'm still getting to do it. So I've never worked a hard day in my life. So I've been one of the lucky ones.
Well, yeah,
and
that's
actually,
true.
the wrestling stuff was just a fun hobby that led into a pretty good deal. Like, I mean, growing up as a wrestling fan and just bonding with my dad, going to the old Winnipeg arena cards, going up watching the American Wrestling Association, and then actually having a chance to meet a lot of these guys and work with some of them. And then, of all people, the heavyweight champion, one of the greats of all times, Nick Bockwinkel, puts in a good word for me. Vince McMahon, who he happens to be having dinner with about 3 weeks after I got to meet him. It's funny how they say timing is everything, but it really is.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about next, actually, was that stint you did working with WWF. And you already referenced Nick Bockwinkel putting in the good word for you. And obviously, you know, you had the voice that they liked because, again, having that New York accent, it really comes across strong on television and in videos. So what was that experience like?
Well, it was interesting because back then I didn't have any TV experience. It was sort of self-taught. I mean, I grew up watching Marty O'Neill, who was an older announcer, and then, of course, Gene Okerlund was with the AWA, and that's who I grew up watching. And I would just get excited listening to him cut his promos doing interviews. But the funny thing for me was I'm sitting here, and I'm as nervous as heck doing about a 4-hour night of matches with Nick Bockwinkel, who I'd never worked with, and you guys know doing the show together, timing doesn't just happen in 1 week. You guys get your routine down. So basically what happened was they were looking for somebody to fill in for Sean Mooney. Sean Mooney was one of the TV announcers there and a good guy, and he was getting married. So it was a 2-week stint, and I guess at that time, Gene Okerlund was in Florida, and he used to go out on the roads. If you remember the old Superstars show, you used to see the interviews done on a stage in the crowd, and that would be Gene doing the interviews. So they needed somebody to do those interviews because they were moving Gene up to Connecticut to do the TV shots that Sean used to do for the towns. So they flew me down there for a tryout, but when they first called me, they called my parents' place, and my mom was talking to somebody, so she phoned me because I had moved out within that 4-month period when I did the show with Nick, and I thought it was a rib. I thought somebody locally was ribbing. Yeah, sure, Mom, the Titan Towers called. Okay, so I called this number, and sure enough, it was an assistant to Vince McMahon asking if I'd come down there for a tryout, and I said, well, what do I have to lose, especially for a 2-week stint? I could take some radio holidays, go do the gig, say I did it, and just come back to my regular job. So they flew me down there for a tryout, and the first person I got to meet was Lord Alfred Hayes, who was in the AWA territory when I was younger. He was in a great storyline with the Crusher for years, tuxedo matches and everything. It was just awesome. Anyway, I mean, as a kid, I grew up paying money to see this guy, and now I'm going to call some matches with him, and it was just awesome. And they got me to do a few other things, and back to timing being everything, I came back home not knowing how it went, and they phoned me back to say they were actually going to be doing a show here in Winnipeg, a TV shoot, and if I could come and stay backstage. So backstage I was for the whole day. I got to meet Vince McMahon that day, and they said, sorry, they're running late on stuff. They want to see me do some live stuff. Would I go to Brandon? So the next day I went to Brandon, and when I went out into the crowd, I got this rousing ovation because people knew me from Tony's wrestling show. And the first interview I ever did, believe it or not, was Rick the Model Martel, who I had a chance to work with The Natural and Rick later on back on the local scene. But anyway, that was the first interview I ever did. And they offered me, instead of that 2-week stint, they offered me a full-time job. And so I started traveling down to the States, back and forth. I did a couple of events down there, and I was actually in Saskatoon the night Bret Hart beat Ric Flair for the title, a match that I believe never aired on TV. It was supposed to be on one of those Coliseum home videos, and I never did see it on one of those home videos. But what a great night it was to be just backstage and then looking through the curtain at these two legends. It was awesome.
Right. Yeah, that
Now,
match is very rare. It's been on a couple of video compilations, but it didn't air
Okay.
on TV, so
And that was actually
yeah,
one of the first interviews I ever did was backstage. Vince McMahon was standing behind the cameraman, and this is how nervous I was. Bret Hart was there, and they made me, since I'm a little bit I was taller than guys like Hart and Michaels and that I'd have to take my shoes off and sort of do a form of the splits a little bit to look a little smaller on camera than these guys. But the thing is, I was so nervous, I couldn't spit out lines they were giving me because most of the time I just improvised my own lines. It must have been about 10 or 11 takes before I finally got it right. And Brett, God love him, was standing there next to me. And he was a real pro, and he said, don't worry about it, man. You know what? You're just a little nervous. I finally spit it out, and I swear, Brett screws up his first line, and we just started laughing, and then we just did it right the next take. But Vince was like rolling his eyes, going, "Seriously, we hired this guy." It was pretty good. But overall, the experience was pretty good. And I could tell you guys why I didn't end up going any longer, actually, because I was offered a radio job here in Winnipeg that I really wanted, and I wouldn't have had to move because the WWF gig at the time I would have needed to move to Stamford. If I was able to work out of Winnipeg and travel, I probably would have tried it. But they were really nice to me. I still got the contract and the letter that Linda McMahon sent me, thanking me for my work. J.J. Dillon at the time was in charge of a lot of the operation stuff, and he sent a nice note. And I still got the blue blazer with the logo on it, and God knows it doesn't fit.
The crest on it.
Yeah, it doesn't fit. I can tell you that.
Now, does any of this footage with you and Brett actually exist somewhere, or is it like lost in the ether?
Well, that interview, honest to God, it was funny because the only copies I have is they were kind enough to send me my audition tape, which was very rare that they would release any of that stuff. And that is on, I think I have it on a VH or 3/4 copy. I don't remember the type of machine it runs on because I haven't seen it in years. And God love my mother. She taped all those interviews from Superstars and the other programs I was on. So I can remember the interviews. I did one with one of my all-time favorites, and I was supposed to have dinner with him 5 days after he had passed away. But Owen, I have one with High Energy, Owen Hart and Coco Beware. I'm doing an interview with them in one of the broadcasts that made it into North America. One of them was with the Bushwhackers dressed up in Christmas outfits, and they both pulled down their beards, and they both licked my face in the interview, and I make this horrendous-looking face, and Vince came up to me after. He says, "Oh, that's great. Great acting." I said, "That wasn't acting, Vince. That was the real deal. These two guys licking your face." I did an interview in the ring with the Big Boss Man about a bobby stick or on the pole match that he was supposed to have. I can't remember who the opponent was. And a couple
it was
of other
Nails.
It could have been Nails. You're right.
Survivor Series.
So and doing stuff like that. And when I started there, that was when Kurt Hennig was back in the picture because I had interviewed just around and before summer. Or just after SummerSlam, when the Ultimate Warrior had just left, and that's when Flair was just starting out there. So it was a pretty monumental time. Hogan was gone, Savage was still around. So there's some pretty big stars, and Undertaker. Like it was a pretty cool experience actually.
Yeah, I remember my first memory. So this would have been probably October or November of '92, and there's 14-year-old Rowan watching Superstars, and there's Joe Aiello. But if I recall, your name wasn't Joe Aiello, was it?
No, they changed it to Joe Beavens. So I called the office because I didn't know they were changing it to Joe Beavens, and I said, "What?" So they told me what happens, of course, and everybody that's a wrestling fan and listening to this program knows that they change, in most cases, your name, so they have the rights to your names. And I said, well, I don't know if I look like a Beavens, but if that's what they're going with. And it took me about 6 months to find out where the name Beavens came from. And apparently, I got this story from Sergeant Slaughter, and Sarge told me, he says, well, the thing is, Gorilla Monsoon at the time, who was always in the gorilla position and that, had such a problem remembering people's names sometimes, you just call them Joe Beavens. So they ran with that. It was almost like a side rib, but that was the story behind that. So
Did you ever hear the story of how Steve Austin got his name?
Yeah, with his wife.
His-
The nickname? Or are you talking
No, actually,
about
no. It was even before that when he first came in and the booker said, "What's your name?" Said Steve Williams. Said, "There's already a Steve Williams." Said,
right?
"You got 15 minutes. Come up with a name," and he comes back in 5 minutes. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
so now when was I guess you kind of already touched on this. Was the intention for you to work there long term, or did you know going in that this was only going to be temporary? Or I guess you were just waiting for the radio full time position to open up? Or
Well, what happened was I had full intentions of leaving, and they were working on my visa. At the time, you could get a work visa or a green card, so their lawyers were working on that. And a few things, timing is everything again. A few things changed at the radio station, and they asked me to fill in while I was waiting to go. And then this opportunity came up here, which was obviously a decision that I had to make as far as I was getting married 7 months down the road, and we had to make a decision: were we moving or were we staying? And just because of the job at hand, moving to Connecticut and then having to travel from there wasn't really conducive. And you know what? I got there, I did what I wanted to do with them, and it really wasn't the best of lifestyles. And it was guys like Brett who I ran into a few times later, because they still used me to do some ring announcing gigs in Winnipeg when they come through or whatever they needed. And any of those guys will tell you, if you can get off the road, do it. So it kind of made me feel a little better about my decision to stay home and do the radio thing. And it's worked out pretty good since that was, God knows, a long time ago. And a few people are still being fooled. So it's good. I still have a job.
so after all this, now you went back to go do some more work for Tony, right?
Yeah,
Now
I did a
I
little
don't
bit
know.
of work for Tony, and then Don and I and Tony, I just for kicks said, you know what, most of my wrestling bucket list has been completed, but you know what, why wouldn't I promote a couple of shows? So it was funny, but I was lucky enough that, and Don did the booking for it, and Tony did the local promoting for it, but we booked an ECW kind of reunion match at the time, and had some success with about 2 or 3 shows, and then I was done with that and moved on to that. I even had a wrestling store here for a while I was, so yeah, I've kind of fallen off the wrestling track a little bit. I stay in touch with a few people, and you never know, some might pique my interest to promote another show or something, but it's pretty tough because of the independent talent that's available out there right now. So
Now, talking about Don Callis, and he's another one that I would love to be taking on the show here.
he's elusive. He's hard to get a hold of, that guy.
Yeah, I heard him on Jim Cornette's show, and I thought, oh man, I'd love to have him on here. But how did you rank him as a talent, and do you think he got a raw deal from the WWF?
Yeah, you know, I can't really say too much because I don't know the whole story there, and it's not something, and Don and I have been friends for a long time. It's not something we've ever really talked about, and I'm never going to broach the subject. It's always been one of those, if he ever wants to talk about it, fine. Don's a very intelligent guy, like outside of wrestling, and I think he had a lot of wrestling smarts. I think timing was everything for him, too. I don't think the timing was necessarily the best when he was there, and what opportunity they gave him. I think he did the best he could with that opportunity. But I thought really the best I saw some of his stuff was in ECW.
Oh yeah.
Just the stuff he did as the Jackal, and that I thought was cool. And even on the local scene, like at a young stage, like he had a pretty brilliant mind for putting together what you could on a local program. And some of the stuff that was done. I'll tell you, he was a master of the mouth. He saved himself from falling on his back a lot of times. We used to joke about that too, that he was pretty good at not taking a lot of bumps. So I guess you got to give him credit for that. And he's still walking pretty good. So, but he was always a great interview. That was the one thing about Don. And I mean, he could improvise on the fly. And there was just some nights he was so good that he'd be saying something that was supposed to try and make you laugh, and you just have to bite down on your lip because he was going to crack you up.
Well, I'll never forget, late 1997, you were doing the ring announcing in the Winnipeg Arena. I was in the crowd, and
my
this,
gut.
and this
I know what line you're talking about. I came out to do an interview with him, and the whole idea was Jim Neidhart was going to come out and clean his clock when he was done his interview. and he was supposed to be a villain, and he says that he grew up in the mean streets of Tuxedo, which is a pretty affluent area in Winnipeg. And if you reference that line, Shane McMahon and the Mean Street Posse, was that what they called?
Yep.
Or what were they? Yeah, they actually stole that line and called it the Mean Streets of Greenwich, and that was a Don Callis line way before the Mean Street Posse came out. Yeah, it was a brilliant line because everybody in the crowd just started busting a gut. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody in the crowd was popping. Everybody in the back probably had no idea what he was talking about.
You know what? Coming out of Winnipeg, it was pretty cool because, I mean, Roddy Piper, you know, who started with Tony in Winnipeg doing some stuff, and then, of course, it was the AWA for him, which is based out of Minneapolis. But we grew up all knowing Roddy had started out of Winnipeg. So if you were a big wrestling fan and got a chance to do it, you know, it was pretty cool because really Chris Jericho came out of here and really worked hard in other spots in the world and made it huge. Don got there. I was lucky enough to get there for a stint. I mean, it's a pretty cool thing to see. I mean, even though the business now is pretty much run by one major company, right, in North America. So, but yeah, it's not a pipeline to success for wrestling, really, but these Canadian, like I love that Lance Storm is still running a school and giving people an opportunity to get out, but there's really no local television anymore at all. You might get some stuff obviously on the net, but it's a different game, right?
Absolutely. What I like to do is throw a couple of names out here that maybe not a whole lot of our listeners will know, but you will certainly know, and just a little bit of word association. So
okay.
just like the first thing that pops into your mind, good, bad, or indifferent. Chi Cruz.
Oh, wow. I think that was one of Manitoba's best-kept secrets. I think that was a guy that had some good charisma, a lot of fire, and good passion. Probably should have been a bigger star than he became.
Champagne Jerry Morrow.
Champagne Jerry Morrow was one of the nicest guys and brilliant heels that I ever met in the wrestling business, just because of his mannerisms in the ring. And I still remember my favorite interview, and it's one of my all-time favorites that I was ever able to do, when he won the Canadian Heavyweight Championship. And we handed him the belt. I did an interview with him, and I looked right in the camera because he was terrible at speaking English. And he was just rambling that. And I said, it doesn't matter if you can understand what he says or not. You don't have to like him, but he's your champion. And I still to this day couldn't tell you what he said in that interview. We laughed pretty good about it after. Great wrestler.
Kerry Brown.
Sorry, Kerry Brown?
Kerry the Pitbull.
Kerry the Pitbull Brown. We lost him a lot earlier than we ever should have lost him. He was a good guy and one of the best bump men I've ever seen for a guy that size. Boy, he was a heck of a wrestler.
I'd be completely remiss if I didn't mention this name, Jethro Hogg.
You know, I didn't know Jethro too well, except when I did see him at events. He was a nice guy, and obviously that he lived the gimmick. If I do recall, he was a farmer, and that's where it all started with his pig. And if you ever get Tony on the show, you have to ask Tony the pig story on one of the Northern Death Tours, because he was afraid of the pig. And the story, the way I heard it, was one night when they were sleeping in one of the school gymnasiums, I think they put a trail down of snacks for the pig right up onto Tony's pants. And they let the hog loose, and he ran up and started snouting all over Tony, and it scared the bejesus out of him. I believe that's the way the story goes.
That sounds awesome. Stevie, what do you got?
Well, as long as we're doing the name association, I know that Joe mentioned Diamond Timothy Flowers, and I've heard a lot of stories about Tim Flowers on Pacific Radio wrestling shows, so I wonder if he can mention something about him.
I'll tell you, the times Tim came to Winnipeg, he was a cool dude. He obviously was a student of the game. He was a great big guy, too, but boy, could he talk, and he had the crowd believing. He was one of those guys I thought, seriously, was one of those guys that should have been a big star here in North America, for sure. I mean, we had a chance to see him, obviously, through Vancouver and that, and we brought him in, and that was a pleasure. He was one of those pros, boy. Oh, good one.
Yeah. And did you have a chance to call Chris Canyon or work with Canyon at all?
No. Actually, the only time I ever met Chris Canyon, I can't remember if it was show 1 or 2, but I was the first guy to bring Fozzy, Chris Jericho's band, into Winnipeg, of course, Chris's hometown, which was a cool night, and it was after a WWE event here in town, and a few of the guys came back, and Chris was one of them, and he was just a nice guy. I didn't get to know him or anything like that, but
Yeah, I was a big fan
great
of his
worker.
work. Oh, yeah, he was a great worker and passed away way too young, so...
You bet. Another one.
Yeah, it's kind of a story of this wrestling business is we lose a lot of guys way too young. And recently we just lost the Ultimate Warrior. And did you have a chance to call anything of his when you were in WWF?
It was funny because the time I was there was just around the time that he was there for the event in Saskatoon. And the only reason I remember that night was because not only was that the night Hart beat Flair for the title, but a bunch of us ended up at a Greek restaurant in Saskatoon. And the Warrior was one of the guys there. And, just high and by, seemed to keep to himself a lot. But what I did find just amazing was, because, everybody talks about the steroid era and everything else. And I mean, the fact is, a lot of these guys still were in tune with working out in their body. Well, they talk about a strict diet. Like, I saw this guy order food, but it was so specific, like pasta, no sauce, that kind of thing. And I never forgot it as long as, and then, just reading some of the stuff about, weird how things work out though. Wasn't it amazing though, coincidentally, that he gets to do that interview, and then he passes away shortly after. Like, I don't know if he knew that his time was coming or what, but I just thought that was pretty surreal.
Yeah, for those of us who cover wrestling for a living, it was pretty unnerving, actually, to see him make that grand acceptance speech on Saturday, appear on TV on Monday, and then be gone the next day. It was like, you almost thought he knew by the speech he gave, because he said every man beats his last heartbeat, and that just, it still shakes me thinking about that.
I think, too, as a wrestling fan myself, maybe the thing I've appreciated the most over the last decade is the fact that I don't know as many guys obviously in the game anymore, except for a few guys that are still out there, but the fact that at least they're making peace with some of these former stars, because I think then we, the fans, win. Bringing Bret Hart back, even the Warrior back, and, Hogan, I guess, back. It's just, as a fan, it's nice to still mark out every once in a while and see some of these guys. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I consider myself blessed that I got to see the Hall of Fame induction live in person when Bret Hart went in, because he was one of my favorites when I was a kid. So it was nice to see them come full circle with him, with Warrior, with a lot of the people that they've made amends, bridged the fences with and gotten back together with. It's good that they can build those bridges and make those guys feel comfortable coming back.
Sure, and even some of these guys trying to get healthy again, like even the Scott Halls and the Jake Roberts and those dudes. I think that's obviously a good thing too for the business. So
absolutely, and their wellness program is fantastic for that. But go ahead, Rowan.
Well, I was going to ask Joe. Jake the Snake is scheduled to appear in Winnipeg in a couple of weeks. Did you have plans on going down to see him?
I don't know Jake, so that's probably not in the cards. And I think actually when he's here, I'm actually off for a week. Never had a chance to meet Jake. Was a huge fan, and believe it or not, I'm 48, but I go back to his days when I saw him perform from the Pacific Northwest out of BC when we had that wrestling show here in Winnipeg, and he was a young star. But man, what a guy with psychology! Like, I just thought he was the ultimate in cool when he would do those interviews, because it was so different than anybody else. Yeah,
it certainly wasn't your typical, screaming, "I'm going to get you" type of promo, and I think he's that's certainly his trademark now. My final question for you.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying my last question for you. Go ahead.
No, I'm listening.
Okay. Final question for you from me is: if Tony were to run a WFWA or an IWA reunion show in Northern Manitoba, can we expect to hear Joe behind the mic?
Well, to be honest,
in wintertime, of course.
If there's anybody out there that actually would like to hear that, I don't know if you could find them. Yeah, I would do it just for kicks because of some of the guys that were around. And you know what? I'd like to get Don back on the mic one more time. It would be just kind of fun for kicks. And only because, I mean, Bulldog Bob Brown has passed away and I had a chance to do some stuff with him, and Nick Bockwinkel isn't doing so well at his age now too. So yeah, it would be kind of cool to do something like that, or maybe even run one more live show, which could happen, I guess, still, if there's enough talent out there to make a show worthy of doing. You know, I honestly got really lucky because I was just a kid like anybody else growing up in Winnipeg or any other city that grew up as a wrestling fan, that beat up a lot of pillows along the way, imagining that I was so-and-so and the pillow was my opponent. And, you know, it was just one of those deals where I got a chance to meet a guy, and he luckily gave me a shot at doing something that I was probably terrible at when I first started and didn't get much better as we went along. And I had an opportunity to meet a legend in the Nick Bockwinkel, and I got a shot to work for the biggest wrestling company in the world. I just pretty lucky because at the end of the day, I was and still am a wrestling fan. I don't watch it as much as I used to, but I just been lucky that way. And you know, you guys are honored to do a show. That's a cool thing. Because it's what keeps the business alive, and I like hearing guys locally running shows or abroad, and I hope a lot of young guys get a shot at it because it can be a fun business, and I was just one of the lucky ones to be a part of it. So thanks for even thinking of me for the show.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think in this particular business, and if you brand yourself as a quote unquote wrestling fan, unfortunately sometimes there's a stigma or there's some sort of negative connotation to that. But I think it's great where we can get together in a forum like this and talk about it. It's been a pleasure for me. Where can people hear Joe? Do some plugs. Twitter, Facebook, anything that you want to do. The
well,
floor is
if
yours.
you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Joe Aiello, JoeAiellowWPG, Joe Aiello, Winnipeg. And you can listen to me if you're ever in the Winnipeg area, or online actually at 1023clearfm.com. I do a show called The Joe Show. It's an adult pop station, and I'm having a lot of fun just, you know, doing what I do. And like I said, I've been very fortunate to be able to do it as long as I have, and I never thought I'd be doing it this long. And like I said, for guys who even remember that wrestling stuff along the way is kind of a neat feeling. So I appreciate that, and I'm humbled by it. So you guys keep up the great work, and I do mean what I say. So I will shoot you some info. Maybe you can get Tony on because he's a character and a half. And if you are a wrestling fan listening to the show, you have to see that documentary, The Promoter, because it kind of gives you a nice feel on what goes on behind the scenes with the little engines out there to keep wrestling going. So,
well, again, Joe, thanks again so much, and we look forward to possibly hearing you in the future. Definitely on 102.
Okay, guys, you take care. Good luck with the show.
Have a great night.
Joe.